Okay, so an anonymous 17th century traveller wrote about leprosy, that the whole distemper was so noisome that it might well pass for the utmost corruption of the human body on this side of the grave. And throughout history, there's very few diseases that have evoked such fear and such a cruel but also pious reaction. Now, we know that leprosy was an endemic disease in medieval Europe, but until quite recently, not very much was known about it in terms of medieval Ireland. So several years ago, I was involved in a project that was funded by the British Academy. And as you can see from the list of names here, it involved scholars from a range of institutions across Britain and Ireland. And we basically wanted to focus on the evidence for leprosy in Ireland, because as an island, and located at the far west of Europe, we thought it had the potential to provide, interesting insights in relation to the sort of historical epidemiology of the disease. So the study focused on the 5 known osteological cases of leprosy. So there were 3 individuals from St. Michael le Pole in Dublin, and single examples from Ardree in County Kildare, and then Armoy in County Antrim. Now, understanding the sort of spread and evolution of leprosy, it has advanced greatly in recent years, and that's because of all the sort of advances in ancient DNA studies and the work that's been undertaken on pathogen DNA and looking at the genome of M. lepra. So this is looked both geographically and temporally. So our study aimed to put Ireland into this growing framework of research. So we used a multiproxy approach. So we combined paleopathological, radiocarbon dating, because an isotope analysis and ancient DNA analysis. And the idea was that that might help us to understand about the origins and then the sort of development of the disease in Ireland. So we found evidence of leprosy DNA in 3 of our 5 individuals. So that was the 3 cases from Dublin. So the study then ended up largely focusing on these 3 cases. So I'm going to focus on them in this lecture. But first, before I sort of talk about the cases, I thought it would be useful to give you some background about leprosy and in terms of its osteology and history, and just a little bit about the techniques that we applied. Okay, so what is leprosy? Well, basically, it's an infectious disease and it's caused by Mycobacterium lepra and a more recently identified variant, which is Mycobacterium lepromatosis. It's a chronic disease, and that means that people can live with it for many, many years. There's still sort of some debate about the transmission of leprosy, and it's thought that it might be kind of a mixture of sort of skin-to-skin contact with an infected person or also sort of inhalation of droplets, when a person who's infected with the bacteria coughs or sneezes. After transmission, there's a period of about 3 to 5 years before the signs of the disease actually start showing in the body. Disease, it mainly affects humans, and it attacks the peripheral nerves, skin, the bones, and other tissues, so it's pretty all-encompassing. Now, you would tend to think that it's a disease solely of humans, but actually it affects the chimpanzee, the Mangabe monkey, the armadillo, which I always thought was very strange, and then more recently it's been found in cases have been found in red squirrels, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. So it has a kind of a spectrum of severity, and it really depends on the infected person's immune status, how severe a form of the disease they get. So the spectrum kind of runs from tuberculoid, which is the sort of the least sort of symptomatic version, through to borderline, through to lepromatous, which is the most severe form of the disease and would affect people with sort of weakened immune systems. So this is what we would mostly find evidence for in the archaeological records. And in lepromatous leprosy, you tend to get kind of multiple sort of generalized nodules, like you can see in this woman here in the welcome plate. Untreated lepromatous leprosy also then results in sort of thickening of the upper eyelids. You get sort of collapse of the nose, so the bridge of the nose, so you kind of have like a saddle shape. The upper incisor teeth just below the nose tend to fall out. You also get hoarseness of the voice, partial or complete blindness, ulceration of the legs, Also, this then affects the hands and the feet, and you get shortening of the fingers and toes, as you can again see in those welcome plates. So you also then get sort of paralysis and loss of sort of feeling in the skin. And this then means that people can kind of hurt themselves, without even realizing it. So they're not only under attack by the leprosy bacteria, but they can also be under sort of attack by earthborne bacteria because they don't know they've hurt themselves and the cuts can get infected. So a person with full-blown leprosy can lose all 5 of their senses. And this is one of the reasons why this horrific disease is sometimes called the living death. Now, fortunately today, people with the disease can be treated with a range of antibiotics so that people who come forward with the signs don't go on to form the full-blown version of the disease that would have been very debilitating and is what we see in people from the past. So then how do we actually identify leprosy in our archaeological people? So it produces a very distinct pattern of lesions in the skeleton. You get a focus on what's called the rhinomaxillary part of the skull. So that's kind of the area in around the sort of the nose and the upper part of the mouth. And also then on the bones of the hands and the feet. So the facial lesions, like I said, only really occur in the most severe form, so the lepromatous form of the disease, but you can get the postcranial lesions in the other forms as well. In terms of the sort of the facial area, it's all tied into sort of the infectious processes and inflammatory processes. So you get, there's a little spike at the bottom of the sort of nasal cavity called the anterior nasal spine, and that tends to erode away. The maxillary bone, sort of at the top of the where the teeth are, it basically erodes away and becomes very thin, like you can see in this skull here, and then that causes the loss of those front teeth at the top. And you basically get sort of changes around the cavity, the nasal cavity, like sort of smoothing and pitting and a whole range of sort of little lesions that all together kind of give us an indication of the rhinomaxillary form of the disease. And also you can have your palate affected and you can get a perforation in the palate as well. Now, the lesions of the hands and feet, they can involve changes to the metacarpals. So that's kind of the main body of the foot, but also then the phalanges. So that's basically the toes. And what we call what happens diaphyseal remodeling, and the bones resorb. And basically it's sort of colloquial term, but the bones end up looking like sucked candy. So it's like a stick of rock that's been sucked. And you can see that in this case here, that some of the bones kind of taper and look a bit narrow, towards their ends. You can also spy lesions that are to do with the anesthesia, and sort of flexion of the hands. So we can find like little pressure erosions, where the hands have kind of been locked in a position because of nerve damage. And like I said earlier, a person with leprosy is because there's sort of an anesthetic aspect, they can be, they can suffer cuts and injuries, and especially on the soles of their feet. And then you get evidence for secondary infection. So you would find lots of evidence of sort of infectious processes in the feet and then also in the lower leg bones. So people are quite often surprised to know that leprosy was an endemic disease in medieval Europe, because today its principal locations, are sort of characterized by a tropical environment. But it is a sobering fact, that the World Health Organization sort of figures estimate that today there's approximately 5 million people worldwide, infected with leprosy. So as you can see from this map, it predominantly affects people in sort of Africa and Asia, South America and Oceania. So while we're unlikely to contract leprosy in Europe today, during the Middle Ages, like I said, it was an endemic disease, and it would have even reached countries as far north as Norway. So in terms of the history of leprosy, we know that it's probably been in Britain since sort of the Roman times, and then kind of increased steadily throughout sort of the Anglo-Saxon period. And like I said, by the Middle Ages, it was a fairly common disease because it was sort of endemic. And the whole social history of leprosy is really fascinating, and I don't really have time to go into it here, but there was a very sort of complex social and theological response to the disease, and it was largely tied into fear of actually catching it. Theological response seems to have been sort of tied in with the kind of notions of the Bible, that people with leprosy was a sort of were immoral, and that this was like a physical manifestation of immorality. But in the 11th century, this concept seems to have been modified a bit, and the leprosy sufferer was sometimes viewed as somebody who was actually enduring purgatory on earth. And that meant that then they would be able to sort of go straight to heaven after death because they'd already done enough suffering, during life. So Ireland's island status, it doesn't seem to have acted as a barrier to movement of people during medieval times. And we know that, for example, religious scholars like St. Columbanus, would have traveled throughout Europe. And you can see here's a lovely window sort of dedicated to him in the Abbey of Bobbio in Italy. We know from scholars who are looking at sort of trade in exotic objects, they've been able to kind of see a development, from in sort of around the 400s to 600 Mediterranean trade through to sort of predominance of Gallo-Frankish and then Hiberno-Scandinavian in sort of 800 to 1150 AD. Now, we know that the Viking connections had a particularly prominent impact on the island of Ireland through the establishment of towns, and there's been quite a number of Viking burials discovered, especially in the centre of Dublin. We know then that the Anglo-Normans, invaded Ireland in the 1160s, and again, Dublin would have been impacted on this. So clearly Ireland was very well connected during medieval times. And, when we set out in our study, we kind of speculated that maybe sort of the cases of Irish lineage could be connected to some of these sort of incursions, if you like, particularly those that are known to have involved a large scale movement of people. So in our heads, we were kind of thinking, maybe it's something to do with the Norse or something to do with the Anglo-Normans. But before I move on to look at the skeletal cases themselves, just want to sort of point out, we do actually, even though there's a bit of a paucity of osteological cases, we do have quite a lot of secondary evidence for leprosy in Ireland. So there's references in historical sources, in the annals and various texts, although sometimes leprosy was used as a general term for sort of skin diseases, so we have to be cautious about interpreting those. There's a lot of place name evidence that contains the word lower, which is the Irish for leper. So for example, Balna-Lower is the town of the lepers, and now that's Leopardstown. So again, we've got these kind of hints to connections with the disease. We've also got leper squints. So this is just one example from St. Nicholas's Church in Carrickfergus. But again, anybody with a disease who didn't want to be part of the main congregation could have, used a window like that. So it's a bit hazy in terms of its association with leprosy. Gerald Lee did a study, probably I think it was in the 1990s, and he recorded at least 50 leprosy hospitals in medieval Ireland. Now, most of these were associated with Munster and Leinster, and the hospitals in Dublin associated with the disease were those including St. James's, St. John the Baptist and St. Stephen's, which are all sort of approximately founded in the 13th century. So like I said, despite this kind of quite broad range of secondary information, we've only got 3 sites that have produced, definitive evidence or definitive osteological evidence for the disease. So the first sort of definitive case was found back in 1998, and I was really intrigued with the whole idea that leprosy should be on Ireland. So it was a kind of a lucky sort of constellation of events that I happened to be excavating on the cemetery at Armoy inside St. Patrick's Church, and lo and behold, we found an isolated pair of feet, and they showed really classic signs of leprosy. And more recently, Carmelita Troy found a case of leprosy in the Ardree burial ground in County Kildare. So the Armoy case is quite late, it would be sort of, in the 1400s to 1600s, and Carmelita's case from Ardree is sort of more between sort of 1300 and 1400. Now, the 3 Dublin cases that ended up forming the main focus of our study, they were discovered at the cemetery of St. Michael le Pole at Golden Lane in Dublin, and they were first reported by Laureen Buckley, and this is the cover pages from her article in Archaeology Ireland. So the excavations were directed by Ed O'Donovan, and they took place in advance of development in 2005. So the team found 272 individuals, and then there were these 3 individuals with very clear evidence of leprosy. Just from the map, you can see that the Church of St. Michael le Pole, it's located about 100 metres south of the walls of the Viking and Anglo-Norman town of Dublin. It sits on a ridge overlooking the River Poddle that separates the church site from the sort of city to the north, and then the Black Pool to the east. So it also seems very significant that the St. Michael's Church is only about 300 metres from the known 13th century leprosarium at St. Stephen's. So I'll return to this a little bit later on as well. So our project, like I said, it adopted a multi-proxy approach. So we wanted to really try to get a good understanding of these cases and what was going on with them. So we used osteoarchaeology, ancient DNA, strontium and oxygen isotopes, and then tried to sort of put it into its archaeological and historical context. So we wanted to kind of know, how might these individuals have been sort of physically affected by the disease and when they'd lived. The biomolecular aspects basically involved a small sample of bone. And this was led by Professor Mike Taylor from the University of Surrey. And the objective of that was to try to identify leprosy in the individuals. And then if it was well enough preserved, to actually try to identify which strain had caused the disease in these people. So we were able to actually take it to the full genome stage in 2 of the individuals. And again, I'll talk about those in a minute. So Professor Alistair Pike from the University of Southampton, he led on the analysis of the strontium and oxygen isotopes. So this involved like a tiny sample of, like a sort of profile of tooth enamel, and then a piece of rib as well. And the idea of this was to try to determine where these individuals had spent their childhood years. So the oxygen isotope ratio data from tooth enamel, it's mainly an indicator of the water that these people would have drank. So probably particularly drinking water, which could then have been sourced from sort of the rain or the groundwater. But there are some issues with the data produced, and you have to take into consideration, other factors. So for example, the latitude, the distance from the coast, the level of precipitation, air temperature, etc. So really, it's best to interpret oxygen isotope results alongside strontium so that you've got the information from the 2 sources. Strontium, it's also then incorporated into the body from ingested food and water. And this would happen, as the teeth and the bones are forming. So if we make the assumption that ancient people would have sourced the majority of their diet locally, if you find then differences in strontium levels, you can then determine whether individuals had a local or non-local origin compared to the place where they ended up being buried. And like I said, tooth enamel forms during childhood. So the records that we're looking at in terms of strontium and oxygen, they date to that period, because we know that an enamel doesn't remodel during life. It's kind of like a fixed record of a person's childhood. So what we're really looking for then is the kind of the geology and the groundwater of the region where these people would have lived during childhood. So now we're going to look at the information for each of the 3 individuals from Dublin. So we'll start with skeleton 148. So you can see from the picture, this was a very well preserved individual. It was a probable male, had quite good sort of sexually dimorphic features. They were adolescents, so they were between 13 and 18 years. You can see they've got an atypical burial position. So they're lying in a sort of a semi-flexed position. One arm, the left arm is up towards the neck or sort of chin, and then the right hand is on the knee. The radiocarbon dates indicated this person dated to about AD 939 to 1030. And I kind of wondered, was the sort of atypical position, was it something to do, with the sort of Hiberno-Norse aspects of this population? Was it because the person was an adolescent, or was it tied into their disease status? Because, in other cemeteries, we sometimes find that people who've got a disease like tuberculosis tend to be buried in a sort of a flexed position. And I kind of just wonder, in some cases, is it tied into, what positions were most comfortable for the person during life? So that's a bit broad, and I can't really go into it here. But anyway, you can see they've got quite an unusual position. But you can see the head is towards the west as well, which is sort of more typically Christian, if you like. So lesions suggestive of leprosy were evidenced in the feet. And there was also then sort of evidence of infection in the ankles and the wrists, but the face of this person wasn't affected at all. In terms of the sort of the biomolecular aspects, so you can see in the table down at the bottom, it only worked up to a certain level because of the preservation of the DNA. It was basically, it gave like a weak positive result for leprosy, so we were confident that leprosy was there, but the DNA was too fragmented for further sort of genomic work. In terms then of the strontium isotopes, we were able to use kind of values from publication of Kelly Knudsen and colleagues, and they had sort of established, you know, the local sort of strontium range for Dublin, and they established that to be sort of 0.7084 to 0.7106. So the value for this person you can see here is 0.70990 to 0.7095. So it kind of fell within the sort of the expected sort of Dublin range. So if you were just going on strontium, you'd be thinking, yes, this person is possibly from Dublin. But whenever then we got the oxygen isotope results, this was sort of more depleted than what we'd expect for somebody who originated in Ireland. And it sort of suggested that there was the person maybe had an origin that was further east. So, you know, places where you'd find this kind of combination of the sort of 0.70990 to 95 and the kind of an oxygen range of -9 parts per million are the Vale of York, Central Europe, Denmark, and southern Sweden. So again, you know, kind of given Dublin's association, you know, with Vikings, it is possible that we've got a Scandinavian here, and that they spent their childhood, so between kind of 2.5 to 8.5 years of their life in Scandinavia. So we'll move on to the next one then. So this was another very well preserved skeleton. This time it was a middle-aged man, and you can see he's got a sort of typical Christian burial, and he's a bit later than the first individual. So the radiocarbon dates were 1152 to 1260. He showed very clear sort of facial destruction, so very clear facial lesions of leprosy. So there was near destruction. So this sort of gap that you can see just beneath his nose, like that's not post-mortem damage, that's part of the disease process. So he'd had a lot of damage to the kind of the facial part of you know, below his nose and of his nose itself, and there was perforation in his palate as well. There was also then sort of clear signs of the disease in his hand, in his feet and ankles, and you can see the kind of the sucked candy kind of profile of some of the bones that I talked about earlier. And you also get sort of like a cup and peg deformity, and you can see the sort of cupping of some of the phalanges as well. So the osteology is very clearly, you know, indicating leprosy. And whenever we undertook the DNA analysis, this time the DNA was well preserved, and the genomic analysis suggested that he had type 3I1 strain. So this is a lineage that's been found in other cases excavated in Britain and as well as in Denmark and Sweden. So his strontium results were very unusual because they were unusually radiogenic, and they were kind of high. So they're sort of similar to what's been found in other areas like the Rhine Massif, the Ore Mountains of southern Poland, and the Carpathians, as well as Norway and Sweden. So we can't rule out that this person may have had a Central European origin, but again, kind of, you know, looking at the broader picture and, you know, Dublin's association with the Vikings, it would sort of make it seem reasonable that on the basis of the strontium isotopes that this person is of Scandinavian origin. Now, the oxygen values were a bit tricky because they do fall within the accepted range for Ireland, and sort of typically kind of drinking water equivalents for southern Scandinavia would be sort of -7 to -10 parts per million. But there's one area, so it's the coastal southern Norway, where you get oxygen values less than 7 parts per million. So that could kind of correlate with what's happening here. So again, you know, when you combine the strontium and the oxygen results, you know, they are suggestive of a Scandinavian origin for this individual as well. So if we look then at the last person, so skeleton 230, again, very well preserved individual. another middle-aged man, and he again had a sort of typical Christian burial, and you can see he's even got earmuff stones at either side of his head. He also had, characteristic lesions sort of lepromatous leprosy in his sort of facial area, sort of damage to the rhinomaxillary area, very clearly perforated palate, and his sinuses were all filled with sort of like little spicules of bone. So he had sinusitis that was probably secondary to the leprosy. He had minor lesions in his feet and ankle, but again, there wasn't that many of them, but they were very typical for leprosy. And he also had this then large kind of oval shaped lesion, right in his forehead. So that's something, when we think about these people, they did suffer, quite a lot of facial disfigurements, and that no doubt, would have had a sort of an impact on their mental well-being and how other people responded to them. So again, his DNA was very well preserved, and it was really interesting that the genomic analysis revealed that he suffered from type 2F strain of leprosy, so a completely different strain to the one we looked at previously. His strontium isotopes tended to kind of match parts of Northern Ireland, Eastern Wales, and the British Midlands. So we sort of seem to have somebody this time who maybe grew up somewhere that wasn't particularly far from Dublin. And then the oxygen values tended to fall within the accepted range for Ireland. So his profile was a bit different to the preceding two. So what's the significance of all this then? Well, I mean, we were blown away really that there were two separate branches of the leprosy phylogenetic tree, if you like. And you can just see in this map, the different sort of strains have been plotted. So you can see now Ireland's got like a 3I and a 2F. So the only two results we've got for the island, and they're different. So that was quite special. The radiocarbon dating for the individuals suggested that these two strains would have been coexisting in 12th century Dublin. But we don't know how long they would have persisted for because we just simply don't have any more cases as yet. So, I mean, that's something hopefully in the future might get resolved. The type 3I then, so this is tended to be thought of as having a sort of a Scandinavian origin, but a fairly recent discovery is that it's been found in modern red squirrels. So these would be squirrels from Brownlee Island in England. And this kind of discovery then opens up the idea of a zoonotic spread. So zoonotic is basically, a disease that spreads from animals to humans, but it can be vice versa as well, like humans might give the red squirrels a disease too. So it is quite fascinating to think, could the fur trade actually have contributed to the spread of leprosy in medieval times? So that's another area that I know my colleague, Mike Taylor, he's actively trying to research, and looking at sort of archaeological squirrel bones from Scotland and other places. So I don't know if we've got any archaeological squirrel bones in Ireland, but that would be really fascinating to try to develop and see if we can get to the bottom of this idea. So the second strain then was type 2F. So previously type 2s have been identified as a likely sort of precursor strains, that then evolved into type 1 strains. And it's thought that maybe it sort of migrated from the Middle East to India and Southeast Asia. And today it would be found in places like Turkey and Iran. So we're getting hints that Dublin and Ireland were well connected in medieval times. So we kind of then sort of tried to take stock of all this evidence. We've got our strontium and oxygen isotopes are suggesting, two possible Scandinavians, and then, someone from either like the north of the island or from Britain. And again, looking at the archaeological context, we know that the Vikings arrived in Dublin in the sort of AD 840s. And we just threw it out there, this idea, did they bring more than towns and currency, etc., to Ireland? Were they responsible for bringing leprosy to? Okay, so then in terms of the significance in Dublin, so we have 3 people with leprosy separated each by, separated by a couple of hundred years. So skeleton 148, the adolescent. So if you remember, he was early 10th to early 11th century, and he clearly predated the other 2 individuals. And again, at the start of this, I kind of assumed they were all going to be contemporary. So that was another really interesting kind of twist in the story. The 2 adult men then, one dated to the early 11th to early 13th century, and then the other one was mid 12th to mid 13th century. So the teenager would have post-dated the arrival of the Vikings in Dublin. So he would have lived in a sort of Hiberno-Norse world. We know that St. Michael's Church was founded around AD 1000 and was thought to have started out as a proprietary church. The interments at the site, they generally tended to follow Christian burial practices. So you've got the body in an extended supine position with the head to the west. And as you saw in the previous slides, this was the case for the two adult men. So you're kind of getting a sense that they're maybe following Irish cultural norms. And I thought this was particularly interesting then for skeleton 195, because if they grew up as a child in Scandinavia, you know, were they part of the sort of Hiberno-Norse world, you know, and you've got mixed, you know, a Scandinavian person who's kind of adopted the practices that were happening in Ireland at the time. Now, it might have been a chance event that led to the burial of skeleton 148 in the burial ground, but the later deposition of two sort of, you know, later individuals with the disease just seemed to me to be too much of a coincidence. Now, the earliest reference to the foundation of St. Stephen's Leprosarium, it comes in the Dublin Corporation records for AD 1230, although I think Howard Clark in his RIA Atlas also suggested it might have been founded by AD 1192. And this site is located about 300 metres from the St. Michael's site. And given the dates of the two adult men, it's possible that they were alive when it was founded. Now, if you look at the map, both the Church of St. Michael and the Hospital of St. Stephen's, they lie outside the medieval town walls in what probably was a sort of a rural environment near St. Kevin's Gate. Now, this is, I'd be very interested to kind of hear, you know, from all the archaeologists and historians who are specialising in Dublin, you know, is it possible that this area was associated with leprosy as early as the 10th century? And then this was then sort of formalised later through the foundation of the St. Stephen's Hospital. Now, the content of the Dublin Corporation records of AD 1230, in relation to St. Stephen, they record an agreement in the King's Court between the master and inmates of the hospital with Geoffrey and Sarah Tyrrell, and this is related to a land conveyance. And then the area became known as Ballinalower or Leperstown. And the people of Dublin are considered to have founded the hospital, which was then being run as a civic institution. So the isotopic information, it's suggestive that skeleton 148 was of Viking descent, while the later skeleton 195 may also have had Scandinavian roots, and skeleton 230 was unlikely to have been native to Dublin, so perhaps originating from the north of Ireland or central Britain. And it's possible that this kind of long-standing presence of leprosy in the vicinity of St. Michael's may have kind of led on to the establishment of St. Stephen's Hospital. But I think we also then need to consider the possibility that maybe these individuals chose to be buried at St. Michael's because of cultural reasons, or actually that they may have even been excluded from, you know, being associated with St. Stephen's Hospital. So the records suggest that St. Stephen's was an Anglo-Norman foundation that would have operated under their regulations. So maybe these people were sort of like considered as outsiders or non-locals, and maybe they were, that's why they were then excluded by the hospital master or inmates. Or, you know, the other idea is that maybe they just had their sort of felt cultural affinity to the older sort of Hiberno-Norse foundation. Alternatively, then, maybe there was an arrangement in existence between those who managed the two institutions that resulted in the utilisation of the St. Michael burial ground. And it's actually, I find it very intriguing that even though there's been quite a lot of excavations around the sort of area of St. Stephen's Hospital, as far as I'm aware, there's been no osteological evidence for leprosy, you know, come from that site, as we might expect to find it there. So a lot of questions still remain. But these three cases from St. Michael's, they really provide us with a tantalising glimpse of the cosmopolitan nature of Dublin in medieval times. But I think it's also interesting because, you know, they highlight how pathogens can kind of hitch a ride and spread across populations. And this is something, you know, there's never been a time when we've been more acutely aware of this, you know, as we live through the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.